When probabilistic AI agents operate without supervision, they often drift into recursive feedback loops. These cycles accelerate until tool calls derail, token counts spike, and the agent fragments into digital noise. UC Berkeley's Frank Coyle identifies this as an engineering crisis. Without rigid rules, an agent's reasoning quickly loses contact with its intended function. To stop this drift, engineers apply an ontology. This provides a structural grid validating agent outputs against permitted categories. This essentially forces modern large language models to function like 1980s symbolic AI. In immediate testing, these semantic guardrails prevent logic loops and short-term hallucinations. The Bridge360 Metatheory framework, however, identifies an unaddressed structural risk in this approach. Relying solely on an ontology forces the agent to treat a simplified, resource-bounded map as though it were the final reality of the environment. Bridge360 classifies this phenomenon as ontology smuggling. Introducing an ontology imports a hidden epistemic regime, an unstated assumption that the selected categories are universally accurate. Connecting this ontology directly to the agent's real-world action execution module creates executable metaphysics. The contestable map becomes an executable command structure, dictating what the agent recognizes as an entity or risk. If the map misses a detail, the agent is structurally blinded. This grants operational sovereignty to a provisional model, allowing the system to take real-world actions that exceed its actual epistemic warrant. The result is a widening gap between what the system understands and the physical power it is authorized to exercise. Real-world information spaces are computationally intractable and subject to constant noise and adversarial change. Kurt Gödel's Incompleteness theorems establish that no sufficiently complex formal system can certify its own internal completeness. Similarly, Turing's halting problem proves that no general algorithm can predict whether an arbitrary recursive loop will eventually terminate or drift forever. And W.V.O. Quine's underdetermination thesis shows that empirical evidence alone never forces a system into a single, uniquely valid set of categories. These mathematical and logical constraints prove that absolute truth is an unattainable standard for any AI ontology. An ontology that operates without rollback procedures ignores these limits, falsely assuming a state of logical closure. Forcing an agent to act as if its ontology is complete creates a state where the system makes decisions in a vacuum, detached from the actual complexity of the open environment. When an AI executes actions based on a rigid, incomplete ontology, the uncertainty it cannot process begins to accumulate. As the grid attempts to map unpredictable data, the structure warps under the pressure. This generates leakage, unmanaged uncertainty that manifests as misclassification. In Bridge360 terms, this leakage drives the fragility index toward the 0.40 limit, leaving the system vulnerable to minor perturbations. Bridge360 defines this state of uncontrolled, accumulated uncertainty as an entropic blowout. At an institutional scale, the agent's logic becomes recursive. It feeds on its own biased classifications, creating irreversible, coercive real-world consequences. When unmanaged entropy drives the fragility index beyond its threshold, the system shatters under the weight of its own rigid logic. Bridge360 addresses this by pivoting from a truth-seeking model to the Entropy Attractor Intelligence Paradigm, or EAIP. EAIP defines intelligence as the capacity to manage systemic entropy under finite cognitive and operational budgets. This management occurs within the unified probability space, a normalized scale mapping all systems from 0 to 1. The subinterval between 0.45 and 0.65 is the epsilon spine, the navigable corridor where structure and adaptation are balanced. Values below 0.45 represent the inbreeding zone, a state of over-constrained rigidity that breaks when conditions change. Above 0.65 is the blowout zone, where structure dissolves into ungovernable noise and hallucination. Safety in these systems depends on forcing the agent's normalized entropy eigenvector to remain securely inside the epsilon spine. To enforce this corridor, Bridge360 uses Axiom 19, an admissibility filter that replaces binary truth checks with thermodynamic constraints. Before an ontology can guide action, it must pass through a sequence of gated requirements. First is the caveat vector. This metadata signature forces the system to declare its scope, its assumptions, and its validity horizon. Next, the system must account for its leakage budget, capping the amount of uncertainty and misclassification the system is permitted to generate. Finally, deterministic rollback ensures that any high-stakes intervention can be repaired or reversed if the ontology fails. These requirements strip the ontology of its metaphysical authority, converting it into a bounded navigational tool. Axiom 19 transforms a potentially totalizing world model into a revocable action grammar. Standard engineering attempts to stabilize the agent. Bridge360 stabilizes the environment in which the agent operates. The difference between these architectures is the location of governance. On the right, the EAIP architecture wraps the ontology in Axiom 19 limits, ensuring it never achieves sovereign authority over actions. Frank Coyle's research establishes that semantic constraint is a necessary requirement for agentic reasoning. The Bridge360 Metatheory adds that admissibility governance is a necessary requirement for the ontology itself. A governed agent safely manages uncertainty within its containment field, redirecting erratic energy without ever fracturing its internal structure. Reliable autonomous agents must be engineered to recognize and declare their own epistemic limits. An ontology provides necessary constraint for an agent, and rigorous meta-governance provides necessary constraint for the ontology.